forcing a new direction for the strategic partnership between the U.S. and Pakistan after a series of setbacks. Islamabad is now threatening to shoot down U.S. drones in its territory. Does this signal the end of their cooperation or a chance for each country to re-establish their position in their thorny relationship? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. It's good to have you with us. I'm Divya Gopalan. So, the last contingent of U.S. personnel vacated a key airbase in Balochistan province, southwest of Pakistan, on Sunday. Islamabad has demanded the U.S. leave the strategic Shamsi airbase in protest against the 26 November NATO airstrike on a Pakistani checkpoint, which killed 24 soldiers. Pakistan's Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Jalani has called the strike an attack on the nation's sovereignty and set a December 11 deadline for the United States to get out of the base. Around 20 U.S. cargo planes landed in the Shamsi airbase over the past week to shift military equipment and American staff. They had been using the base since late 2001 for military operations in Afghanistan and drone strikes in Pakistan's tribal area. But the Pakistani decision to evict U.S. troops from the strategic Shamsi airbase was not the only measure Islamabad took in retaliation against a deadly strike. Immediately after the NATO attack, the Pakistani government said it will review its intelligence and military cooperation with the United States and NATO. The Pakistani government closed 2 border checkpoints for NATO supplies into Afghanistan through Pakistan. And just a couple of days later, Pakistan decided to boycott the Bonn conference on Afghanistan that was held on December 5th in Germany. The timing of this latest incident could not have been worse. The two sides had already been trying to repair their frayed relationship, which took a hit after the U.S. operation which killed Osama bin Laden on May the 1st on Pakistani soil. Islamabad accused Washington of violating their sovereignty. Relations took a turn for the worse in September following a Taliban attack on a NATO-U.S. compound in Kabul. Top American brass accused the Pakistani spy agency of secretly supporting the anti-U.S. insurgent group, the Haqqani Network.
The Haqqani Network, for one, acts as a veritable arm of Pakistan's internal services intelligence agency.
And joining us now are our guests in Islamabad, Ali Sarwar Naqvi, a former Pakistan diplomat to the U.S., and in Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, Senior Fellow and Director at the Center for Political Military Analysis, Hudson Institute. Welcome to you all. I'm going to start with Mr. Ali Sarwar Naqvi, and I want to talk about certain comments that were made very recently by the Joint Chiefs of Staff General, Martin Dempsey, who says that after the border incident recently, Pakistan-U.S. relations are in a mess. Now, for a U.S. military man to say that, and as a former ambassador, what do you think this means for relations between the two sides?
It means that the relationship is at a very low ebb, and there has to be a concerted effort to deal with the present situation. But I think that we have been there before. I recall that when I was in Washington, the Pressler Amendment was was imposed on Pakistan, which meant that there was no certification by the President on Pakistan's nuclear program, and all economic and military assistance was terminated. We have been there before, and it's a very tortuous relationship at certain times, but then there have been some very good phases of the relationship as well. So we have to see how things go.
Richard Weitz, from your point of view, from Washington, have relations ever reached this low before?
No, this is probably, I mean, it might have been close, but this is probably the worst. The previous speaker, though, correctly noted that this has been a reoccurring problem in U.S.-Pakistan relations. It begins with actually the independence of Pakistan. Pakistan moved very closely to the West, tried to work with the West, particularly the United States. The United States was open to that, but Pakistan's main concern was India. And the U.S. main concern was, for example, for most of the Cold War, the Soviet Union. So we were trying to reach out to India, and that created problems. The Pakistanis expected more help than they got. Then we have the war in Afghanistan. We were very close, but when that was over, we sort of left, and from the Pakistanis' point of view, that whole problem was dumped on them. And the previous speaker correctly mentioned the tensions we've had over nuclear weapons. But this idea of having Americans and Pakistanis shoot at each other, these incidents are very disturbing. It's very unusual, and I would think that that would actually bring it to one of the lowest levels according to many metrics.
Mr. Naqvi, do you think that the U.S., we were talking about Americans and Pakistanis shooting at each other, although inadvertently, do you think that relations could go so low that it will actually lead to confrontation between the two sides?
I don't think so, actually, because there is too much at stake on both sides to avoid going to that stage and to that level of confrontation. In any case, I mean, there is no inherent hostility or animosity between the United States and Pakistan. We have worked together. Yes, I agree with our friend in Washington that this has been a relationship of cross purposes, and there have been many points of divergence at all times, but it has also been a very fruitful relationship, and it has suited Pakistan and the United States to work together. So I think we will not reach that stage. There are rational minds on both sides which will try to deal with this situation and avoid it. However, for that to happen, there will have to be a concerted effort on both sides to avoid such a situation and to again rebuild and repair the relationship.
Mr. Weitz, do you agree? Could relations ebb so low that there will be actually some kind of a confrontation between the U.S. and Pakistan?
Well, I think things will get worse before they get better, so it sort of depends on how you define confrontation. Will the Americans invade Pakistan to seize their nuclear weapons, as I sometimes read it in the Pakistani press? No, that's not going to happen. Will Pakistan officials give their nuclear weapons to terrorists so they can bomb New York and London or wherever? No, that's not going to happen. But the Obama administration's got a problem. They're trying to get out of Afghanistan. They're giving themselves timelines. There was some flexibility, but their plan is basically to turn around the war as much as possible, to weaken the Taliban, strengthen the Afghan forces, that when the U.S. and NATO troops leave, they can stand on their own. And their main concern is that the Taliban is able to strengthen itself, rearm, and sally forth from beyond the Afghan-Pakistan border. So they don't consider that border necessarily so sacrosanct that they're not willing to engage, for example, in drone strikes against Pakistan. And this, I think they're going to actually escalate this as they pull out, because once the U.S. is out, they're not going to go back in. There might be some distant drone operations, but at that point, the Afghan Taliban really needs to be weak enough so that the Afghan government, which in your other programs we all know has got a lot of problems, is going to be able to resist that onslaught.
I'm glad, Mr. Weitz, you brought up the fact that the U.S. pullout of Afghanistan, because that sheds new light on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, where many observers say the U.S. will now need Pakistan more without their presence in Afghanistan. And in that case, Pakistan could take advantage of the situation and maybe position themselves, as they say, with as much aggression towards the U.S. without the repercussion that they would have faced before. Would you say that is appropriate? Do you think Pakistan would use this to their advantage, the fact that there will be a lesser presence in Afghanistan?
Well, it's a bit hard to say. You can argue it both ways, because once the U.S. troops are out, then we need to work with other actors to promote our interests as much as possible. I mean, the U.S. will still have a major diplomatic presence. There might even be military troops there. But in any case, they'll need to work with partners. And Afghanistan is certainly important enough to Pakistan that there's no solution you can consider for that conflict, no lasting solution with that unless Pakistan is satisfied. That said, there are going to be other actors who would be uncomfortable, for example, with Afghanistan coming under complete control of Pakistan, particularly Afghans themselves, but the Indians, perhaps some other countries. So, and also we no longer need their supply line, so that weakens one point of leverage. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. In some ways, we'll need Pakistan more, in some ways less. I mean, the ideal solution from the Obama administration point of view is if Pakistan, India, Russia, China, the Central Asian countries, and although they won't say this in public, Iran, get together and come to some kind of agreement to establish a neutral Afghanistan, and then reconcile internally through some kind of diplomatic settlement. So you'd want a dual settlement, one within Afghanistan, one among the regional powers. And then the problem will negate itself and the Americans can worry about other things.
In theory, that does sound the ideal situation, but in practice, it could be a very difficult compromise to come to. Mr. Naqvi, how about you? What do you think of the U.S. pulling out of Afghanistan? Do you think that that will leave Pakistan in a stronger position with the U.S. to have more of a bargaining chip?
Well, personally, I think that we have to get out of this syndrome of bargaining and taking advantage of each other. I think we have to think coolly and rationally about the basic parameters of the new relationship, and that's why Pakistan has been calling for new terms of engagement. Now, the point is that Afghanistan is, of course, the main focal point at the moment in the relationship, and we are both agreed on the broad parameters of what is to be done. It is very strange, you know, that just 2 years ago, till 2 years ago, since the Kerry-Lugar bill was adopted in 2008 until 2009, there was talk of a permanent strategic relationship between Pakistan and the United States, and there were all kinds of doubts and concerns expressed about Afghanistan, which was a corrupt government and with great influence of warlords, etc. Now suddenly Afghanistan is all good, Pakistan is all bad. Pakistan has been rendering a lot of support and help to the United States, and we should not go on this particular peak that has occurred between us, and then, you know, diplomacy should not be it's too serious a business to be left to the military. We have had the statements of Mike Mullen and then Dempsey, and these are military people who are making statements about bilateral relations. I think the State Department and the Foreign Office in Pakistan have to work out a rational, sensible approach where we don't just keep on hurling accusations at each other.
Now, you talk about a new relationship, but at the same time, Pakistan has promised to match the U.S.'s aggression, especially after that drone strike, which killed the Pakistani soldiers inadvertently. When you say match the U.S.'s aggression, already you're talking about a deterioration in the relationship and the fact that they are now not going to be compromising, and there doesn't seem to be much room for diplomacy. Can you see that actually happening? I mean, it's happened with the air base already, the military base. What next can Pakistan do to match the aggression, as they say?
Well, I think we have to wait it out. We have to see. The tempers are very high on both sides. And then, however, I must make the point that this is a temper on the military front on both sides. The military leadership on both sides are very upset with each other. Now, we have to let things cool down a bit. Maybe Pakistan will insist on all the steps that it has announced to be taken, and action to be all the action needed to implement them. But some months down the road, maybe sometime next year, we have to look at this and see how we can take a rational approach to sorting out our misunderstandings.
Mr. Weitz, what is your view on the fact that Pakistan has said that they will retaliate against the U.S.? And as we just were speaking about now, one of the steps they've taken is trying to oust U.S. boots on the ground. Do you think this is well received in the U.S.? And what direction do you think then this is going to lead to as far as the military relationship between the two sides?
Okay, we have to be a bit careful, because when you're saying quoting these statements match aggression, I'm sure some Pakistanis are saying that. Just like if you were to listen to what some Americans are saying, such as the Republican presidential debates, they say a lot of things. I'm not sure. I mean, there's going to be a big difference between their declaratory policy and what they actually do. So what they're saying in public and what they do in private is very different. I don't have privy to all the cooperation going on between the two sides, but my impression is it's very extensive, and in fact the military relationship is fairly good. They can speak the same language, they've worked together. I mean, there was a problem for a while, we weren't training Pakistani officers in the U.S., that's been solved. I'm more worried about some of the political rhetoric, political inflammation. And so you could think of some scenarios where it could go a lot worse. For example, change in government in Pakistan. We've been sort of fortunate in that the civilians are in charge, and they're actually with some of the most pro-Americans around. There are a lot other Pakistanis who are much more closer to the kind of rhetoric you were reading, who would be much more difficult to deal with. But I think we can take some optimism in the fact that look what's happened with the U.S. relationship with Turkey. As you recall, there were the Turks actually held the United States in much lower opinion than anywhere else in the world. It's about on par with Pakistan today after the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And so we got in the same kind of conflicts we're having now with Pakistan over Afghanistan, we were having with the Turkish government over northern Iraq, where they were concerned we were allowing Kurdish terrorists to run free, and there were all sorts of other problems. And maybe a year ago, 2 years ago in Washington, after the dispute between Turkey and Israel heated up, there were people saying, well, Turkey is just going to join the Iranian-Syrian camp. But things have changed. Turkey is now, as we know, leading the charge against the Syrian government, their strained relations with Iran, and U.S.-Turkish relations, and particularly on the military front, have never been better. So I think these things could turn around very quickly between the United States and Pakistan, depending on regional dynamics, because we do have a lot of common interests. I mean, there's certainly some concern about maintaining regional security. The Pakistanis and we both have an interest in averting a new war with India. So you could think of all sorts of scenarios that would bring us together again.
I can also think of some scenarios that may cause a larger wedge between the two sides. And one of them is this recent development where the U.S. government has decided to, not the U.S. government, sorry, the Pakistani government has decided to restart talks with the Pakistani Taliban. Mr. Naqvi, from your point of view, what is the logic behind doing this in Pakistan, and how do you think that's going to be received outside of Pakistan?
That is not very surprising. I mean, the United States itself wants to hold talks with the Taliban. Pakistan is trying to establish some kind of equation with the Taliban in terms of negotiations and discussions. That does not mean that we are sort of making peace with the Taliban in terms of agreeing to their kind of demands and ideas. The point is that the approach should not be an entirely military approach of just beating the hell out of them. That has not worked. It has not worked in Afghanistan. It's not working in Pakistan. So obviously there have to be approaches in working out a solution. The object is not to win or lose, or to defeat or to make somebody sort of surrender to you. The object is to find solutions, and for that purpose there would be some approaches which would require talking to the Taliban and holding some kind of negotiations.
Mr. Weitz, what do you think the U.S. would make of renewed dialogue between the Pakistani government and the Pakistani Taliban, given what's happened recently, given the fact that Osama bin Laden's been found in Pakistan itself without Pakistani he's been captured without Pakistani effort. What do you think that might of this?
Right. Just to clarify, there are several groups that we're talking about here. There's the Afghan Taliban that wants to return to power in Afghanistan. There's the so-called Pakistani Taliban, which is not, their ties are closer than before, but they're still different entities. They have ambitions to how they've changed what's going on in Pakistan. And then there's the so-called, foreign terrorists, the Al-Qaeda group, which is very dwindling very much. There are not many left of them in this region. The last time the Pakistani government worked out these deals with the Pakistani Taliban a few years ago, it was poorly received in Washington. Because what they did was they agreed to something of a truce, and so the Pakistani army withdrew from the area, and this allowed the Pakistani Taliban to strengthen and then invite the Afghan Taliban and the Al-Qaeda terrorists to take over there. So it sort of depends. If we understand we need Pakistan's help to negotiate with the Afghan Taliban. I mean, they have the most influence. Without their support, no peace agreement can last. The Pakistani Taliban, it's an internal situation. We want to end the killings. Americans sometimes forget that the Pakistanis too are suffering in the war on terror because of these bombings. Many Pakistani soldiers have bravely given their lives fighting the Pakistani Taliban. It would be good if we could end the conflict, but it can't be that you end the conflict at the expense of Afghanistan. It's got to be some mechanism to bring them into the political system and basically to bring that whole region lying between Afghanistan and Pakistan better integrated into the two countries, and increase the economic and social welfare of the people, but get them to stop fighting with the two governments. And so the Pakistani government might have a good strategy for negotiations, but it depends on what we see as the outcome, with how it's going to be received in Washington.
Mr. Naqvi, if the U.S. decides to diminish its presence there and diminish their support for Pakistan, can you see China filling that void? Currently, they are already shoring up ties with China, Islamabad and Beijing. Is this a viable option for Pakistan?
China is a very good friend of Pakistan, a steadfast friend, and we have always had very close military and civilian cooperation. China has stood by Pakistan despite the fact that we have two totally different systems. Even at the height of Chinese communism, it was a friend of Pakistan, and even today it is a very good friend. So despite our different systems and different approaches, China and Pakistan have been very steadfast and consistent friends. Now, as far as China is stepping in, I don't think that it's a question of China replacing the United States. It's a different relationship that we have with the United States. The United States is a global power. We need to have good relations with it for that reason. But China will, of course, be very supportive of Pakistan, whatever the situation might be.
Richard Weitz, what do you think? Can China fill that gap? They currently now are one of the biggest suppliers of arms to Pakistan. Is that a concern for the U.S.?
Now, I'm glad you brought up that issue, because China is a bit of a mystery here. The U.S. is a bit divided. I mean, China is Pakistan's best ally by far. I mean, in terms of public ratings of the Chinese, in terms of how much support they get from China rhetorically. Pakistan would love to align itself with China and just forget about the United States. The Chinese have always backed away from that. I mean, recently, last year, the Pakistanis were basically inviting them to come up and set up their first overseas naval base in Pakistan. They declined. When the economic crisis was hitting Pakistan, they went to China to get the economic aid they needed. They didn't get it, so they had to get it from the Americans. It's a bit of a mystery here, because if the Chinese, if they were thinking competitively with the U.S., they could easily take Pakistan out of something of a U.S. camp and move it to theirs, but they're not. And the thinking is, well, it's a bit of a mess. Maybe they don't want to deal with it. Maybe it's better they can just free ride and let the Americans deal with this problem. But at some point, if current trajectories continue, China continues to become a more wealthy country, there's more rivalry between China and the United States, you could very well see that kind of a change. And that might move India closer to the United States, or Russia has some place. That's a very interesting dynamic, but it's probably so complicated we should address it in another show.
And thanks to our guests, Ali Sarwar Naqvi and Richard Weitz. And thank you, our viewers, so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.